This program is brought to you by the Foundation for Ancient Research and Mormon Studies. This lecture is one in a series exploring the message of the Book of Mormon and its invitation to everyone to come unto Christ. The speaker is James E. Smith. The title of this lecture is A Study of Population Size in the Book of Mormon History.
On its title page, the Book of Mormon presents itself to us as an abridgment of the record of the people of Nephi and also of the Lamanites, engraved on metal plates by Mormon in the late 4th century. Mormon's son Moroni added an abridged record of the people of Jared and other writings. Then Moroni buried the plates in about 420 A.D. Some 14 centuries later, the resurrected Moroni directed Joseph Smith to the plates in a hill in upstate New York. Joseph translated a portion of the record, returned the plates to Moroni, and in 1830 published his translation as the Book of Mormon. Latter-day Saints believe the Book of Mormon contains a record of some important events which took place somewhere in the Americas. One of Mormon's key purposes was to show God's action in history, or in his own words, to show unto the remnant of the house of Israel what great things the Lord hath done for their fathers. These great things the Lord hath done are recounted in numerous historical narratives, such as those describing Lehi's exodus from the Old World, the Liahona compass miraculously guiding Lehi's ship, Alma's conversion from among the wicked priests to found the church, the conversion and liberation of Limhi's people, the ministry of the resurrected Jesus in Zarahemla, and the preservation of the sacred records for future generations. These and many other historical narratives in the Book of Mormon include numerous historical details, such as proper names of people and places, carefully dated events, recitals of speeches and letters, explicit descriptions of warfare and political intrigue, and details of personal religious experiences. Latter-day Saints base their belief in the Book of Mormon on a personal spiritual witness received along the lines described by Moroni in Moroni 10, verses 4 and 5. In witnessing to the truth of the Book of Mormon, believers typically affirm the book's religious teachings and its historical factuality, its historicity, as a record of real people and actual events in the ancient Americas. In order to further understand the historical dimensions of the book, Latter-day Saint scholars have examined it from the perspectives of linguistics, geography, archaeology, history, and a number of other branches of scholarship. Today we'll discuss the Book of Mormon from the perspective of historical demography. Demography is the study of the size of human populations, their changes in size over time, and the characteristics of those populations. Since the Book of Mormon tells us about certain groups of ancient peoples and how they fared over time, perhaps we can get some ideas and methods from historical demography to help us to expand our understanding of what the sizes of these populations were in this record. In today's discussion, we'll principally deal with a group known as the Nephites, starting with the first person called Nephi, who was Lehi's son, and who lived in the 6th century BC. We'll note a few points about the possible population history of those early Nephites, beginning at this early time, and then we'll move right down to the time of Mormon. Mormon himself says that he was a literal descendant of Nephi, and of course Mormon lived about 1,000 years after the first Nephi had come to the New World. In our discussion, we'll want to rely upon good information from the field of historical demography, and we'll want to read the text of the Book of Mormon carefully. Most of all, we'll want to recognize that good study and good scholarship always recognizes its own limits. We will not have all of the answers all of the time. We need to remember that the Book of Mormon was not intended to be a modern scientific history, and it certainly was not written to tell us about population sizes and such things. Instead, like the biblical record, the Book of Mormon is intended to convey a religious message of profound importance. So if we choose to examine the book from other perspectives, such as historical demography, we will often be dealing with limited historical information, and we'll be trying to make reasonable estimates, sometimes even conjectures about a number of things that the authors didn't directly tell us. As an ancient historian who had studied the population of ancient Rome puts it, we will need to rely upon whatever bits of information are provided in the text, along with, quote, a certain degree of demographic sense to decide what is probable or improbable, end of quote. We should not expect quick and easy answers in the study of any ancient document. So let's begin with the work. The first rule of any demographic study is to define the population being studied. Nothing but confusion results from discussions about populations where we're not sure of what we're talking about. Modern demographers use geographic boundaries, citizenship, residence, ethnicity, gender, age, and other characteristics to define populations. But for populations in the past, particularly the distant past, there's no such statistical rigor. We are usually left to guess about precisely what an ancient author might have meant when referring to some particular population. Let's go back more than a century to the earliest days of Book of Mormon study in Joseph Smith's own time to visit some ideas and some changing ideas about Book of Mormon populations as these were discussed and contemplated by Latter-day Saint students of the Book of Mormon. During the 19th century, the most influential view of Book of Mormon history was expressed by Orson Pratt. In an 1840 British missionary tract, he wrote very matter-of-factly that Lehi crossed the Pacific Ocean and landed on the western coast of South America. The Nephites colonized the northern part of South America and expanded into North America as well, while the Lamanites possessed the middle and southern parts of South America. After Jesus visited the Nephites and Lamanites were all converted unto the Lord, both in South and North America. By the 4th century, the Nephites were in North America and the Lamanites in South America, with wars between them at the Isthmus of Darien, which we know as the Isthmus of Panama. These wars pushed the Nephites northward until they were finally exterminated at a great battle in what is now New York State. Some 30 years after Orson Pratt first published these views, he was still preaching them in the Salt Lake Tabernacle, and they seem to have been pretty widely accepted. In general, this set of ideas makes up what is called the hemispheric view of Book of Mormon history. It's called that because this view suggests that the events reported in the Book of Mormon involve some places in South America, some places in Central America, and some places in North America, the whole Western Hemisphere. Orson Pratt's views also were incorporated into his footnotes for the 1879 LDS edition of the Book of Mormon. Although these footnotes were not an official church interpretation of the book, they did represent and reinforce what had become a prevalent hemispheric view of Book of Mormon history. Now, in the decade after the publication of the 1879 edition of the Book of Mormon, there were very lively discussions about Book of Mormon geography. But the church did not offer any official interpretation on these matters. In 1890, George Q. Cannon, then a counselor in the First Presidency, wrote in a church periodical that the First Presidency would not issue an official statement on Book of Mormon geography, since, quote, the word of the Lord or the translation of other ancient records is required to clear up many points now so obscure, end of quote. So in preparing for the next edition of the Book of Mormon, a church committee heard different views on Book of Mormon geography. But apparently this committee did not find any theories about such things convincing enough to include them in the footnotes to the new edition of the Book of Mormon. Thus, when the new edition of the Book of Mormon was published in 1920, it omitted historical and geographical footnotes, and that's a practice that has continued since that time. As the 20th century progressed, it became apparent that among students of the Book of Mormon, the hemispheric view was being questioned and revised a great deal. John Sorensen, an anthropologist at Brigham Young University, who has studied the Book of Mormon extensively, has analyzed more than 50 published statements on Book of Mormon geography from the 1830s to the present. His analysis shows that before the early 20th century, the hemispheric view of the Book of Mormon was common. However, by the mid-20th century, most students of the Book of Mormon believed its history took place somewhere in what we now call Central America or Mesoamerica. Today, almost all writers on Book of Mormon geography agree that Lehi's landing place, the narrow neck of land, the lands northward and southward, and Mormon's Hill Cumorah were situated somewhere in Central America. Recently, John Sorensen has himself suggested a specific Mesoamerican setting for the Book of Mormon, involving roughly a few hundred miles square. Now let's consider what some of these views of Book of Mormon history have to do with populations in the Book of Mormon. According to the hemispheric view, the American continents were empty of people when Jared's party arrived. When the Jaredites self-destructed, Lehi and Mulek's recent immigrant groups were left to repopulate the land. This would imply that all pre-Columbian inhabitants of the Americas, including all of the populations of the Olmec, Maya, Inca, Aztec, and other North and South American native populations, and their descendants down to modern times, would have grown from the 3 Book of Mormon migrations. Perhaps this is possible, but it does not seem likely from the archaeological and other scientific evidence. Thus, the shift toward the view that perhaps the stage of action for the Book of Mormon was on a more limited scale. In 1927, Jana Sjödahl wrote that, quote, students should be cautioned against the error of supposing that all the American Indians are the descendants of Lehi, Mulek, and their companions, end of quote. Sjödahl believed that the Jaredite population may not have been completely extinguished. And also, it was not improbable, he said, that America has received other immigrants from Asia and other parts of the globe. In 1938, a Church Department of Education study guide for the Book of Mormon told students that, quote, the Book of Mormon deals only with the history and expansion of 3 small colonies which came to America, and it does not deny or disprove the possibility of other immigrations, which probably would have been unknown to its writers, end of quote. The study guide further noted that, quote, all the Book of Mormon text requires is Hebrew origin for at least part of Native American ancestry. At mid-century, Hugh Nibley was saying that other populations unknown to Book of Mormon peoples could have lived in the Americas. Thus, quoting Brother Nibley, once we have admitted that all pre-Columbian remains do not have to belong to Book of Mormon people, the problem of the Book of Mormon archaeologist, when such appears, will be to find in America things that might have some bearing on the Book of Mormon, not, he emphasized, to prove that anything and everything that turns up is certain evidence for that book, end of quote. In 1967, Nibley again argued that, quote, the Book of Mormon offers no objections to the arrival of whatever other bands may have occupied the hemisphere without its knowledge, end of quote. In 1980, Nibley was still teaching that it is, quote, a simplistic reading of the book to assume that the only people in the hemisphere before Columbus were either descendants of Lehi or of Jared or his brother, end of quote. While Nibley allowed for other populations in the ancient Americas that were not known to the Book of Mormon, John Sorensen has opened the vistas even wider. Sorensen has asked, quote, when Lehi's party arrived in the land, did they find others there? End of quote. He answers yes, arguing it is inescapable that there were substantial non-Book of Mormon populations in the Promised Land throughout the period of the Nephite record, and probably in the Jaredite era as well. Furthermore, Sorensen finds nothing in the Book of Mormon precluding Nephites and Lamanites from interacting with and assimilating other populations, perhaps from among surviving Jaredites or perhaps from indigenous peoples. He suggests that the term Nephite was a socio-political one, not restricted to literal descendants of Lehi, and that there could have been lingering Jaredite populations after the Great Jaredite Destruction, and that, quote, the early Lamanites had to have included or to have dominated other people, end of quote. Sorensen's work gets directly to the topic of population definitions in the Book of Mormon. The proper pursuit of this subject requires a comprehensive textual analysis of all the references to various peoples made in the text of the Book of Mormon, along with their popular meanings, their possible meanings. No such analysis is at hand, although John Sorensen's article on Book of Mormon peoples in the Encyclopedia of Mormonism is a good starting point. Although we don't yet have a comprehensive analysis on this subject, we can note that the term Lamanite and Nephite are used several hundred times throughout the text of the Book of Mormon. These uses span 1,000 years of history. Perusal of the uses made of the term Nephite suggests a number of variant meanings, such as Jacob's use of Nephite to mean, quote, all who were friendly to Nephi, the king of the Nephites, end of quote. Later, the term Nephite describes a religious community, including certain converted Lamanites. Still later, Nephites means a smaller population emerging from a larger population in which all former ites had apparently mixed together. Such variant uses of the term Nephite did not seem to fit into a single definition of Nephite taken to mean only a literal descent group from the original Nephi. To understand when the term Nephite refers to genealogical descent, that is, descendants of Nephi, descendants of the Lehi-Mulek parties or whatever, and when this term ought to be taken as a socio-political, religious, or other type of name, requires textual analysis and careful interpretation. All of our readings of the text of the Book of Mormon, and especially readings that search for historical and demographic meanings, must be conditioned by this fact. The names given to populations in the Book of Mormon do not appear to have a single meaning at all times and in all places in the book. Now let's turn to some ideas from historical demography that may help us to understand these Book of Mormon populations. Historical demography tells us some very general things and some very specific things about populations in the past. Perhaps the most general thing we know about populations in the past is that they had high mortality, meaning that people died at relatively younger ages than we're used to in the modern world. Demographers summarize the average length of life with the so-called expectation of life at birth, or life expectancy. All that means is simply the number of years on average that an infant could expect to live in the population. Before the 18th century, life expectancy, or this average length of life, was generally well below 40 years in most populations. Sometimes it was as low as 25 or 30 years. By way of contrast, life expectancies today are generally in the high 60s and well into the 70s. Although the chances of death were overall high for everyone in the past, the main reason life expectancy was so much shorter than it is today was severe infant mortality. In many historical populations, between a fourth and a third of newborn infants died in their first year of life, compared to say 1 or 3% today. Now, because of overall high mortality and high infant mortality in the past, these populations had to have high fertility in order to keep their total numbers from dwindling. For example, in a population where females lived on average for about 25 years, those women who did survive to age 50 had to have about 5.1 live births on average in order to keep the population at level numbers. But as high as this number of births may seem to us by modern standards, it's still well below the level of fertility which human populations have achieved in the past. In our example, if the woman reaching age 50 had on average 5.8 instead of 5.1 births, the population would increase at the high rate of growth of 0.5% per year. Or in other words, this population would double every 140 years. And with even higher fertility, say 6.8 births on average to women who reach age 50, this population would grow at a rate of 1% a year, or would double in size every 70 years. Thus, we see it's possible, and it has sometimes happened, that populations in the past, even under severe mortality conditions, could grow and sometimes grew rapidly. We should note here that basic textbook diagrams of world population size, like the one shown here, often show a long flat line, the dotted line, representing world population size for thousands of years. Sometimes these diagrams go on to show rapidly increasing exponential growth in our own time. But we should also recognize that this highly schematic view of population history, represented by the dotted line, could lead us to an erroneous view that population growth in the past was really this flat for long periods of time. As shown by the solid line in this figure, historical demography reveals that patterns of population change in the world population in the past were complex. Sometimes they involved rapid population growth, sometimes precipitous decline, and with the general rule being change and fluctuation rather than any sort of smooth growth curve. Looking at population trends at the regional level also reveals uneven patterns of population growth and decline, as shown in this figure. The European region, for example, in this slide shows an especially dramatic roller coaster pattern of population growth and decline throughout its history. As historical demographer Massimo Livi explains, quote, "The tripling of population between the birth of Christ in the 18th century and the 18th century did not occur gradually, but was the result of successive waves of expansion and crisis during the late Roman Empire and the Justinian era as a result of barbarian invasions and disease, expansion in the 12th and 13th centuries, crisis again as a result of recurring and devastating bouts of the plague beginning in the mid-15th to the end of the 16th century, and crisis or stagnation until the beginning of the 18th century. More localized populations also manifested jagged patterns of population growth, leveling, and decline in the past. For example, there's a population pattern for ancient Egypt that shows a somewhat oscillating pattern of growth and decline, as seen in this slide. In Mesoamerica, there is also a sawtooth pattern of population growth and decline in the valleys of Oaxaca, along with similar but moderated patterns in the basin of Mexico. Moving down to smaller and more localized areas or villages, other small populations, we see that they also experienced ups and downs, sometimes growing rapidly, sometimes declining drastically. In these smaller and more localized populations, migration as well as mortality and fertility made a difference in determining their population change. Now, it might be thought that in societies in ancient times experiencing heavy warfare, like the Book of Mormon people surely did, there would be no chance for population growth. However, in ancient Greece, and the Greeks were no strangers to protracted warfare, they were well aware of their population's tendency to grow. For example, we're told that in 7th century BC Greece, in Argos, and especially in Athens, there appears to have been a population explosion. In Corinth, it was necessary to limit population growth between wars when population tended to increase very rapidly. And we find that the Cretans considered it necessary to hold population in check by law. In ancient Athens, during peacetime, quoting from a scholar of Greek history, population naturally increased rapidly. And when population increased too rapidly, the ordinary recourse was to colonization, end of quote. But even despite these efforts to siphon off excess population with colonization, we find that we're reasonably sure of a considerable increase in the citizen population between 480 and 430 BC. And in spite of much immigration, this increase continued into the 4th century until 320 BC. So what explains this kind of population growth in ancient populations despite warfare, high mortality, and other factors? Quoting again from a scholar of ancient Athenian population, quote, "The Greeks were perfectly familiar with the ideas of growth of population, yet nothing that we know would suggest that the death rate would be low by modern standards, thus leaving only a comparatively high birth rate to explain the population increase." What we see here is that the actual course of population history in the past involves complex patterns of growth and decline, always occurring against a background of mortality that's high by modern standards, but often with birth rates high enough to sustain the population and sometimes to cause the population to grow and sometimes to grow rapidly. Unless we imagine the Book of Mormon populations were exceptional, they probably experienced boom and bust cycles of population change, and they too had the capacity for growth. While ongoing wars may have contributed to their periods of slow growth, or even to periods of population decline, the successful continuation and the expansion of these Book of Mormon populations, as reported in the text, suggests some periods of population growth that at least compensated for the losses due to warfare. Historical demography clearly shows that human populations in the past had the potential for significant growth, and sometimes they realized this potential. Thus, our brief explorations in historical demography amply demonstrate that simple ideas of limited growth in populations in the past, applied uniformly and universally, do not adequately explain what happened to those real populations in the past. We certainly should not view the past world as a Hobbesian world of nasty, brutish, and short lives, where the mortality levels completely dominated populations and kept them from growing at all. As the demographer Kingsley Davis puts it, the tendency to view mortality as the chief mechanism by which human numbers are adjusted to resources is one of those unwarranted and largely unconscious assumptions concerning the nature of demographic change. Of course, this is not to say that populations in the past did not have resource limits, which they did, nor are we saying that they did not experience periodic severe mortality due to famine, war, and disease, which of course they did. But what we have learned is that even in the face of these factors, human populations in the past, even those populations we sometimes call primitive, had the capacity for growth, even though in many cases they did not exercise its growth potential. Now, the most comprehensive attempt to date to reconstruct the history of a population in the past is by Wrigley and Schofield, their Population History of England. Their research showed that it's the interrelations between populations and economics and other factors in the social system, and this included significant levels of fertility regulation that explain population change in the past. We can't apply simplistic approaches to understanding populations in the past. We need to always have in mind the various historical realities and the complexities of history as we now turn to a specific historical example, and then we move on into the Book of Mormon. Let's consider just briefly and informally the population of Quebec. In 1608, Quebec was founded by the French inhabitants of the St. Lawrence Valley, and it was a land that had been virtually abandoned by the Iroquois Indians. During this time period, from about 1600 or 1608, for the next 100 or so years, two pioneers who were documented in the historical record, for example, had 2,150 descendants alive in the year 1730. But of course, not all families had this level of population growth. The famous explorer, Champlain, was very different, and he left no descendants at all. Thus, from the Canadian historical demographic material, which is very rich, and from which we've learned a great deal about the demographics of populations in the past, we see that there was variation in the numbers of descendants that different people had, and that it was possible for pioneering groups to exhibit quite high fertility at various times. In fact, of the 905 pioneers who were born in France and migrated to Canada before 1660, we're told by Massimo Livi-Bacci, of those who did that and who both married and died in Canada, they produced an average of 4.2 married offspring. This level of fertility corresponds to a doubling of the original population in a single generation. Why did this happen in this population? Well, it was the result of an extraordinary combination of circumstances: the physical selection of the immigrants, their high fertility, the unusually low mortality in that period at that time, ample available space, low population density, and the absence of epidemics. Now, I'm not going to suggest that we have to invoke all of these kinds of special circumstances to understand Book of Mormon populations. In fact, I don't think we need to understand Book of Mormon populations. But I suggest this because it's a useful place to recognize that in some populations in the past, there were extraordinary circumstances that led to extraordinary levels of population growth. Let's now turn to some considerations of some Book of Mormon populations. In order to do this, we need to familiarize ourselves a little bit with the historical structure of the Book of Mormon text. The Book of Mormon reports 3 migrations from the Old World to the New World. The first of these migrations was led by Jared and his brother at the time of the dispersion from Babel. Many centuries later, in about BC 600, Lehi's party left Jerusalem, and a few years later, Mulek, whom the Book of Mormon identifies as a son of King Zedekiah, and who apparently did not know about Lehi, led his own group toward the New World. While none of these 3 migrating groups knew of each other in the Old World, their histories eventually connected in the New World. The Book of Mormon begins with an unabridged record taken from the small plates made by Lehi's son Nephi, followed by his brother Jacob, with a brief addition by others. Covering the years from about BC 600 to BC 130, these small plates were added by Mormon to the end of his own abridgment, resulting in the first 144 pages of Joseph Smith's translation of the book. Now, these pages were written primarily as a religious rather than a historical record, and they emphasize the first half century from Lehi down to the death of Nephi's younger brother Jacob. Only the last 9 pages in these 144 deal with the 3 centuries from Jacob's death down to BC 130. At this point, Mormon's abridgment of the historical record on the large plates of Nephi picks up and continues down to Mormon's own time in the early 4th century. Occupying about 320 pages in today's text, Mormon's abridgment is not simply a chronicle giving equal attention to each year. More than 3/4 of the text of Mormon's abridgment focuses on the period from BC 130 to the birth of Christ, and half of the remaining part of this text deals with the brief ministry of Christ in about 334 AD. Then, in merely 4 pages, Mormon presents a sweeping summary of the next 3 centuries of history down to his own time. Finishing off the book are a few pages, about 12, of Mormon's original writings describing his own day. These are continued by Moroni, who also adds the abridged Jaredite record. From this summary, it's apparent that the Book of Mormon concentrates on certain specific and relatively brief historical epochs. The first epoch is from BC 600 to BC 550. It involves Lehi and his 2 sons, Nephi and Jacob, as primary record keepers. The second is from BC 130 to AD 34, and it reports Nephite history from the days of King Benjamin through the ministry of Christ. And the third epoch covers the destruction of Nephite civilization in the 4th century AD. Although the text of these 3, covering these 3 epochs, makes up 90% of Mormon's work, it covers only 300 total years, or 30% of the full 1,000-year span of Mormon's record. Now, I want to remind us here that we're dealing in this discussion with the record of Mormon and with the record that deals with Nephites, the Nephite history. And we're not going to be going into the Jaredite history per se. That's its own topic that's worthy of separate attention. Given this overall structure of the Book of Mormon text, we really fully expect some gaps in the information it presents between the historical epochs on which it focuses. It would be naive to think that we can correctly assume or guess at all of the information that would be needed to fill in these large gaps in the history. Let's take an analogy. Let's suppose we had a modern book that had a 100-page chapter about some events in the 10th century. And let's suppose it had a chapter of 300 pages on the history of certain people in the 16th and early 17th century. And finally, let's suppose that this book concluded with a few pages about the 20th century since World War I. If we had such a book as this, we surely would be cautious about trying to make too much about the historical periods between these widely different historical eras. So our discussion of the populations in the Book of Mormon needs to keep in mind that this book does focus on 3 separate historical epochs with very little information between them. Let's now look at the first epoch in the Book of Mormon. 3 families were represented in Lehi's group as it fled Jerusalem. Lehi and Ishmael took their immediate families, and Zoram went as a servant, who later married a daughter of Ishmael. Sometime between 588 and 570 BC, Lehi died, and his son Nephi fled with himself and 4 other named individuals and their families. That's Zoram, Sam, Jacob, Joseph, his sisters, and, quote, all of those who would go with me, quote, into the wilderness. According to the Book of Mormon, all of those who would go with me consisted of religious believers who accepted the word of God through Nephi. Calling their new homeland Nephi and calling themselves the people of Nephi, Nephi's followers began to prosper materially. They began to multiply in the land and to prepare to defend themselves against the people who were now called Lamanites. Now, this latter phrase, the people who were now called Lamanites, could be read to mean that it's a new name for the followers of Laman, and that's Nephi's brother, of course, and his family. But another possible meaning of this phrase is that some people who were not previously called Lamanites were now so called, presumably because of Laman's new affiliation with them. Although it's unclear exactly when Nephi departed for the wilderness with his followers, it was sometime before BC 569. When creating his record on the small plates in this year, Nephi emphasized that, quote, we had already had wars and contentions with our brethren, end of quote. Of course, brethren here presumably means the Lamanites. For another 15 years, Nephi ruled his people, finally anointing a king to succeed him. After Nephi's death, the term Nephite appears for the first time in the historical record. Whatever previous meanings the term had, Jacob decides to define the term Nephite in this way. Now the people which were not Lamanites were Nephites. Jacob remarks somewhat ambiguously that they, Lamanites and Nephites, quote, were called Nephites, Jacobites, Josephites, Zoramites, Lamanites, Lemuelites, and Ishmaelites, end of quote. But Jacob's intent is to refer to these various peoples, should we call them tribes, according to a simple we-them, friend-enemy scheme. Jacob says he will call them Lamanites who seek to destroy the people of Nephi, and those who are friendly to Nephi I shall call Nephites, or the people of Nephi, according to the reigns of the kings. Thus, Jacob's mention of various ites and his mention of a Nephite king, a temple, significant wealth, and the Nephite involvement with polygyny may suggest to the casual reader a fairly large population living in a fairly complex society. But there's a hint that this may not be the case when Jacob reports that the Nephites have only 2 priests and teachers. Some demographic considerations also raise questions about how large the Nephite population in Jacob's day could have been. Since the founding families of Nephites who followed Nephi into the wilderness are at least partly listed in the text, we can roughly estimate how many descendants this founding group might have produced over time. For this purpose, we'll use the CAMSIM demographic simulation model, which has been used by demographers to estimate numbers of kin, numbers of descendants, and similar things in various historical populations with different fertility and mortality rates. In doing this, we'll ask the question, how many descendants might a group of 5 or so couples have had after 60 years? We choose the number of years of 60 years because we're assuming that Nephi was probably born a decade or so before BC 600, making it 60 years from his birth to the time he handed over the plates to Jacob in about BC 550. Other founders were probably born a little later or a little earlier than Nephi. So we're supposing that on average they were about the same age as Nephi, and that 60 years is not a bad number to use. This figure shows the results of our demographic simulation. It is evident that there's a range of possible numbers of descendants, just as one would expect in a small population subject to random fluctuations. As the figures show, the greatest chances are that there were between about 25 and 35 descendants of this founding group alive near the time of Nephi's death. But we also note that there's a reasonably high probability, towards the right end of the curve, that the number of descendants could have been greater, say between 50 and 65 people. In fact, there's about a 5% probability that the number of descendants was in this range. Now, to give perspective on a 5% probability, it's about the same chance that a family of 4 children today would have all 4 children of the same sex. That's not an entirely commonplace event, but that's not terribly surprising or improbable either. With these demographic results, we see that the Nephite population at the time of Nephi's death and during Jacob's ministry would have been quite small. The key demographic assumptions in this exercise are that the Nephites were in a general environment where mortality was high, where their fertility was just sufficient to maintain overall a general pattern of 0 population growth. We're not assuming any especially high levels of fertility in this population. Of course, these are conservative assumptions. It's entirely possible that this group had consciously high fertility as a pioneer group in a new land. But it would take quite large and probably unrealistic changes in our assumptions to make much difference in the numbers of descendants that we're pointing out here. Even if we double or triple or multiply by 5 these numbers, we're certainly ending up computing a few hundred at most, or a few dozen Nephites in about BC 550. I see nothing implausible about these numbers of individuals who are descendants of Nephi at this time in the Book of Mormon history. It does not seem to me implausible that the Book of Mormon text is talking about these sizes of groups. Sometimes our traditional interpretations may have casually assumed something different. But of course our final objective and obligation is to adhere closely to the text. Our demographic exercise strongly suggests that the various ites that are enumerated by Jacob were small familial and tribal groups rather than full-scale populations and societies at this time in Book of Mormon history. Perhaps Jacob saw it as splitting hairs to continually refer to such small groups individually, and maybe that's one reason he wanted to talk of his people all as one, the people of Nephi, or simply Nephites. Now, by about BC 400, or 200 years after Lehi left Jerusalem, the recorder Jerem writes that the people of Nephi had multiplied exceedingly and spread upon the face of the land. Along with the Nephites, Jerem reports that the Lamanites also were scattered upon much of the face of the land, but they were exceedingly more numerous than the Nephites. Now, how many descendants might our founding group of Nephites have had at the 200-year mark? Numerical estimates are presented in this figure, showing that the greatest chances were of about 1,000 or a little more. However, there are substantial chances that the population could have been even larger than this, with about a 10% chance, over towards the right side of the graph, that there were more than 2,000 Nephite descendants at this point in Nephite history. That's about 400 BC. Whether this constitutes multiplying exceedingly, or whether it's enough people to account for Jerem's comment that the people scattered upon much of the face of the land, is a matter of interpretation. And this might be illuminated by further textual and historical analysis beyond what we can do here. But the population numbers we've put forward, perhaps dozens of Nephites in about BC 550, perhaps hundreds or a couple of thousand in BC 400, are plausible estimates based on a demographic model using some fairly conservative assumptions. The assumptions could be changed, again, to assume that the Nephites intentionally had higher fertility, and our earlier review of historical demography suggests that this might not be an unreasonable thing to do. Or we might assume that there were more founding families than the 5 that we've estimated here. But even changing these assumptions, we can anticipate that the order of magnitude size of early Nephite populations in the first epoch of Book of Mormon history was unlikely to have exceeded a few thousand people who descended from Nephi's original founding group. We now turn to the second historical epoch in the Book of Mormon. This second epoch begins in about BC 130. By this time, there had been a major change in the situation of the Nephites. Sometime in the 3rd or 2nd century BC, a Nephite named Mosiah fled from his people with as many as would hearken unto the voice of the Lord. His party discovered the land of Zarahemla, which was ruled by King Zarahemla, who was a descendant of the same Mulek who left Jerusalem after Lehi. The people of Zarahemla were exceedingly numerous, the book tells us, and they apparently willingly accepted Mosiah the Nephite as their next king. The Book of Mormon reports many fewer Nephites than people of Zarahemla, and many fewer of the Nephites and people of Zarahemla combined than there were Lamanites. With their new Nephite king, the people of Zarahemla became known as Nephites, and the kingship passed down Mosiah's lineage to his son Benjamin and then to his grandson Mosiah. It was upon the death of the latter Mosiah that a new form of government called judges came into existence, and soon thereafter, the Amlethite insurrection yields precise numerical data concerning battle casualties. During a civil war battle in about BC 87 between the Amlethite and the Loyalist armies, the Book of Mormon reports 12,572 Amlethites and 6,562 Loyalists were killed. We can start to estimate population numbers from these counts using what's called a stable population model. The stable population model allows features of a population and its age structure to be calculated given an assumed mortality level and an assumed population growth rate. The calculations are fairly complex, but the results of them are presented in published reference tables, so we needn't go into the details here. Using these tables, we find that a population having a high mortality level and a zero population growth rate would have about 25% of its numbers in the ages between of about 15 and 30. Thus, if we know the number of 15 to 30-year-olds in that population, we can multiply by 4 to estimate roughly the total size of the population. One conjecture would be that the battle casualties during the Amlacite insurrection were heavy, perhaps accounting for 50% of the fighting men. A much lower casualty rate, say 10%, could be taken as another extreme. Under the heavy casualty assumption, the 19,000 combined Amlacite Nephite casualties would imply an army size of about 38,000 troops. If all the 15 to 30-year-old males were enlisted in the army, 38,000 times 4 would yield about 152,000 total males in the population according to the stable population model. This, of course, implies about 300,000 males and females total in the population. Of course, if we assume only a 10% casualty rate, or if we make different assumptions about what proportion of the males were in the army, we would get different assumptions about the total population size. One set of assumptions, for example, would yield a population size about as large as 1.5 million Nephites at this particular time. Now, we might make other assumptions about how large the Amlacite armies were and so on and so forth. And we're going to come up with, some different and speculative estimates about the size of the total Nephite population in BC 87. So we end up with 3 speculative and divergent estimates for the total Nephite population in 87 BC. These estimates are about 300,000, or about 1.5 million, or we can estimate somewhere in between at about 720,000. Such a wide range of estimates is to be expected from such limited textual data, which only counts battle casualties, after all. With further analysis, additional historical interpretation, or refined demographic methodology, these estimates might be narrowed, but that's beyond what we need to do at this time. What's important here is that there are appropriate ways to consider looking at Nephite or total people of Zarahemla population size. With the Nephite population totals in BC 400, let's say on the range of several hundred to 2,000 people, and then by BC 87, coming up with on the order of 300,000 people in our estimates, at least one of our estimates, what are we to make of Nephite population history between these 2 years? First, we need to remember that the definitions of Nephite could have changed quite a lot between BC 400 and BC 87. At the beginning, Nephites may have been mostly descendants of Nephi, whereas in later time, Nephites are those who went with Mosiah and combined with the people of Zarahemla, whom they joined, and who were at least doubly numerous. For the Nephite population to have grown from 2,000 in BC 400 to, say, 100,000 people between BC 400 and BC 87 would have meant an average growth rate of about 1.25% per year. Now, why do we say 100,000 Nephites in BC 87? Well, because there were twice as many of the people of Mulek as Nephites. So 100,000 Nephites plus 200,000 of the people of Mulek would add up to 300,000 total population among the people of Zarahemla and Nephites combined, or what were called the Nephites in the broader sense. This kind of growth rate of 1.25% per year would require Nephite fertility to be quite high, 7.2 live births on average to women who live to age 50. This is quite high, but not impossible. But if the life expectancy of the Nephites were, say, on the order of 30 years instead of 25 years, which was one of our assumptions, we find that the Nephites could have had a 1.25% growth rate if their women had about 6.0 births on average by the time they reached age 50. That is, those women who survived age 50. Thus, in summary of the second epoch of Book of Mormon history, a possible scenario for Nephite population change between BC 400 and BC 87 would be that the population of 2,000 or so Nephites in the earlier period may have had high fertility, generating population growth level of over 1% per year, producing 100,000 Nephites in Zarahemla, who combined with about 200,000 other people who were descendants of the people of Mulek. Now let's pause here to note that extreme caution is needed before positing this or any other scenario as a final statement of historical reality. But at the same time, we should note that there are many comments in the Book of Mormon about multiplying exceedingly and filling the land. And perhaps these are indicative that Nephite fertility was indeed high, at levels perhaps similar to other pre-industrial high fertility groups, like the historical French-Canadian population, the Hutterites, the Amish, or the Mormons. Again, we need not take our interpretations and our estimates as complete or final until more consideration can be given them. There remains the possibility they'll prove wrong, but also the possibility that in refining them, they'll prove entirely plausible. Among the unanswered issues that will eventually need consideration are the questions of the origin and the numbers of the people of Zarahemla. Does our assumption of about 200,000 Mulekites make sense? And the question of who the Lamanites really were and why they are identified in the Book of Mormon as racially different from the Nephites. These topics in Book of Mormon population studies await our serious attention. The critical study of ancient scripture promises no quick and easy answers. Let's now turn to the third epoch of Book of Mormon history, in Mormon's own time. This is, of course, is in the 4th century A.D. Mormon is a military leader who fights and strategizes to keep his people alive. He records several details about Nephite armies. But who were these Nephites whose armies Mormon was leading? Mormon makes the point that he himself is a literal descendant of Nephi and that he has been given the ancient records. And he indicates a very strong sense, a personal sense of continuity with the original founding group of Nephites. But it would be far too simplistic and not supported by the text of the Book of Mormon to assume that this means that all of those called Nephites in Mormon's day were also literal descendants of the ancient Nephi or of his original founding group. Ultimately, in the 1st and 2nd centuries A.D., there were mixing of peoples in which the various ites were not distinguished. And it was from this consolidated body that the Nephites, Lamanites, and other ites emerged again in the early 3rd century. Thus, this complex social, political, economic, and perhaps demographic mixing of populations is only mentioned briefly, but is very tantalizing in Mormon's 4-page summary of the 3 centuries of history from Christ to his own day. From a demographic perspective, it's not hard to imagine a significant population of Nephites in Mormon's day, even under the narrow assumption, however, that all of Mormon's Nephites were literal descendants of Zarahemla. With a moderately positive population growth rate of only 0.1% per year, the population of 300,000 in Zarahemla, for example, could easily produce 450,000 people in Mormon's day. This is a highly schematic estimate. But proceeding forward on this line of reasoning, our stable population calculations reveal that about 28% of this population would be in the ages of 15 to 30 years old. Okay, this in turn implies about 63,000 males in these ages, presumably the males from whom the armies would be drawn. Mormon reports about 40,000 and about 30,000 troops in the year 331 AD and 346 AD. Those numbers are easily attainable according to our demographic estimation. It may be, as Hugh Nibley suggests, that Mormon's armies of these size represent only a part of the total Nephite population for which Mormon was the military commander. This may account for a much larger army of 230,000 that seems to be reported at the Great Battle of Cumorah a few years later. Of course, there's another way of looking at this as we look at the scripture. A half century prior to Cumorah, Mormon attempted to gather all of the people of Nephi together in one body for self-preservation. This led to a treaty with the Lamanites that removed the Nephites from their southern lands and gathered them towards the north. Thus, 50 years later, when Mormon made an arrangement with the king of the Lamanites to move his people into the land of Cumorah by a hill which was called Cumorah, Mormon was only continuing a strategy that had been exercised many years before. Mormon notes that in gathering his people to Cumorah, this included, quote, all the remainder of our people, and that it, quote, gathered in all our people in one, into a land of many waters, rivers, and fountains around the hill Cumorah. As the Lamanite armies advanced on these gathered Nephites, the wives and children were reported to be filled with awful fear as the battle began, and every Nephite soul, we are told, was filled with terror. As the slaughter progressed, Mormon notes that his men, meaning presumably his cohort of 10,000 soldiers, were slain. Later he elaborates that some people, does he mean soldiers, escaped southward, and a few deserted to the Lamanites. And Mormon says that except for these, all my people, save it were those 24 who were with me, were killed. Now this account of the gathering of the Nephites around Cumorah and the battle casualties at Cumorah suggests that maybe there could have been, in a last-ditch effort for survival, a gathering of more than just the armies, but that Mormon and the 22 other leaders responsible for their 10,000 each were gathering up all the men, women, children of the Nephites in, again, their last-ditch effort at survival. If 230,000 was the total size of the Nephite population at this time, we can work in reverse and say, what might have been the army size? Our stable population model suggests that in a population of 230,000, under the kinds of mortality and fertility conditions that may have existed at that time, there could have been about 32,000 men in the age group of 15 to 30. This is strikingly similar to the numbers of Nephites' troops that Mormon reports a half-century earlier. Perhaps then, there was a total Nephite population of about 230,000 at the last great battle of Cumorah. This interpretation doesn't sit entirely well with all aspects of the report of warfare at Cumorah. Cohorts of 10,000 certainly sound like armies. But, on the other hand, a total Nephite population of about 250,000 people total does square with other things that are said in the text. Whatever the ultimate outcome of our explorations in Book of Mormon demography, so far it appears, though, that we can work within the bounds of demographic science to explore the text, and we can use some information and ideas from historical demography to explore this book as an ancient historical record. Over time, serious study of the Book of Mormon from these kinds of interdisciplinary and critical perspectives may begin to replace artifactual and proof arguments for the book. If so, perhaps further attention to historical demography will help to illuminate the record even further. The Book of Mormon, with its various literary, linguistic, historical dimensions, deserves our serious study, and it's the hope of scholarship that such serious study of the Scriptures will ultimately help to illuminate their religious and their historical truths. Meanwhile, if modern scholarship has taught us anything, it is that our conclusions about what we think we know ought to be tempered by a sincere recognition that we don't know it all. Of course, serious scholars in all disciplines know they don't know it all, and we should be wary of those who would make final pronouncements on the Book of Mormon from a position of overconfidence in their own learning or in their own position. From my own standpoint, I find that the kinds of explorations we've engaged in here enlighten, expand, and support understanding of the Book of Mormon as an authentic ancient record. And remembering, as I said at the outset, that our faithful witness of the Book of Mormon relies upon a testimony born of the Spirit, I add my own spiritual witness that this is a true ancient record.
For more information about the Book of Mormon and other related topics, call 1-800-327-6715.